Chapter 4.
What in the blazes are you doing here now?
Maud hissed through his bedroom window, his face crawling with excitement, soon turned to one of horror when he scampered toward the window ledge.
My God! What happened to your face, Baz? Your eye? What sort of bloody bollocks? Can you just hurry up and let me inside?
Basil pleaded impatiently, thrusting his sack up toward him. Maud obligingly stretched out his arm through the window, grabbing the sack.
Wow!
He cried, watching his arm crash against the stone wall of the house, the chinking of the silver, sounding like Santa Claus was in town.
What the hell's in here? My life.
Basil muttered breathlessly, wincing over in pain.
Now let me in, for God's sake. Oh, bloody hell!
Maud gasped.
Did you rob the bank?
Basil shook his head dismissively, avoiding Maud's inquisitive glaring.
Ah, now I get it.
Maud nodded quietly, his shocked face melting into a coy smile of disbelief.
No way. No way. You didn't, did you?
He eagerly searched Basil's face for answers.
Did you really? Shh!
Basil hissed, peering around Maud's garden suspiciously. Not wasting another second, Basil began climbing up the stone of Maud's bedroom wall.
Oh!
He grabbed at his ribcage breathlessly.
I can't climb in, mate. Here, take my hand.
Maud offered, lunging through the window. He thrust his arms under Basil's armpits, while Basil, meanwhile, put his boot onto a stone sticking out from the wall. Maud managed to hoist Basil halfway into the window, but as he pressed his hands into Basil's lacerated back, the pain was all too much for Basil to bear. Basil gritted through his teeth, feeling his wounds split open with fresh blood.
Bloody stop, will you?
Frightened by the amount of blood he saw coming through Basil's clothes, Maud jumped and dropped Basil midair, hopelessly watching him plummet into his mother's garden bed.
Oh, Jesus!
Basil cried, curling into a ball amongst the petunias. He knew then that he was much more injured than he'd originally thought.
Oh!
Maud hollered.
I didn't mean to drop you. It's just that you're bleeding and so much of it. What the hell happened to you, mate?
Basil couldn't answer. He was simply in too much pain. As his dizzying head spun in circles, he lay within the flowers for a much-needed rest.
Sorry, Baz.
Maud frowned, sticking his head out the window.
Hey, Baz, I didn't mean to drop you, mate.
Maud began to panic, observing his best friend's unresponsive state. He quickly glanced over his shoulder.
Psst,
he hissed.
I think we just woke up me mama. Just come through the bloody back door. She's gonna see you anyway.
As Maud disappeared from the window, Basil slowly sat up, brushing away the black soil from his trousers, and scampered toward the back door of the O'Mittenthorpe house.
Come in.
Maud blurted out, quickly swinging the door open, nervously looking around for his mother. He grabbed Basil's sack and plonked it onto the kitchen table.
You must be thirsty, mate,
he said as his fingers hastily opened a bottle of fresh milk, pouring them both a glass.
You're looking like a skeleton in a skin. I'm sorry to say it. Yeah, well, I didn't eat since school yesterday.
Basil muttered wearily.
Or drink anything. Oh, mate.
Maud frowned sympathetically.
You gotta tell me what happened.
He desperately stared into the ghostly white face of his best friend, searching for answers. But nonetheless, Maud knew within his heart that something dreadful had occurred, and he was too nervous to question any further. Suddenly, he watched Basil's eyes roll into the back of his head.
Here!
He stammered urgently, thrusting the glass of milk to Basil's dry lips.
Drink now!
Basil spluttered through his first mouthful, but then guzzled down the glass of creamy fresh milk without hindrance.
Another, please.
Maud hurriedly poured Basil another glass, and he drank that one just as fast as the first. Basil let out a burp and immediately plonked his exhausted head upon the kitchen table between his hands.
What the hell's going on, mate?
Maud leaned into him, pulling up a chair, looking at all the blood staining his clothes.
I'm your best friend. You gotta tell me. I've left my old man.
Basil's muffled voice said in amongst his arms.
I ran away, and I'm never ever going back. You're pulling me leg.
Maud glared at Basil, furrowing his brows. They were both abruptly caught off guard when Maud's mother walked in.
Oh, bollocks.
Maud mumbled under his breath. Oh, sweet Jesus in heaven! Mrs. O'Mittenthorpe gasped, thrusting her hand to her chest. Basil immediately sat upright in his chair. Oh, Basil, my dear, she cried. What on earth are you doing here at this hour? Then her eyes fell over his swollen face. Oh, good God, child! Whatever happened to your face? Oh my, your eye! She quickly rushed to his side and noticed the blood running through the shirt on his back. Oh, Lord have mercy, she whispered, her hands beginning to tremble, kneeling down beside him. Oh, Basil, my darling, please talk to me, dear. As Basil searched for the words, Mrs. O'Mittenthorpe's jaw began to clench. Her whole body shuddered, for she knew all too well what had happened to him. It wasn't the first time that she had witnessed him black and blue. She turned and glared at Maud across the kitchen table for answers. Maud quickly shrugged his shoulders in defense.
Oh, I'm sorry to disturb you at this hour, Mrs. O'Mittenthorpe,
Basil sputtered, lowering his head with embarrassment.
But I really didn't know where else to go.
Hush, hush, my love. None of that chatter, she dismissed affectionately, wiping the tears from her streaming eyes. She dabbed the dried blood from the corner of his eye with her nightdress. Sighing deeply, she stood to her feet and glanced at the blood, seeping through Basil's clothing. I must see your back at once, my dear. She bit her lower lip awkwardly. Basil's heart sank into the pit of his stomach. He was dreading it. Meanwhile, Maud sat on quietly, glancing across the table, feeling awfully sorry for his friend. For years he had known what went on at Basil's house. But Maud, being the great friend that he was, he had sworn an oath of secrecy to never divulge any more than what was absolutely necessary. He had always hoped that Basil's home situation would become easier, but now it was blatantly obvious that it had become inevitably worse. Oh, come with me, dear. Mrs. O'Mittenthorpe spoke quietly, holding out her hand. Basil gently took it and followed her upstairs, with Maud plodding along behind them. The morning sunlight streamed through the bay windows of the guest bedroom as they entered. Never mind now, my love, Mrs. O'Mittenthorpe spoke softly. You are safe here with us. Now please, it's important that you let me remove your clothes right away.
Okay.
Very gently, Mrs. O'Mittenthorpe began removing each item of Basil's clothing, one by one, with Maud sitting on the bed, watching close by. As she slowly unbuttoned his clothes, each layer was more soiled with blood than the previous. She reluctantly removed his singlet, which finally revealed the atrocious mess, viciously carved throughout his back. A lifetime of belt lashings, scars, bruises, and seeping fresh wounds ultimately exposed Basil's deepest, darkest secret. Mrs. O'Mittenthorpe's knees grew weak. Oh my! Oh God! She uttered under her breath, her bewildered eyes fluttering frantically. She lost her footing and stumbled backward and hit the carpet with a heavy thud.
Mother!
Maud cried, running from the bed to console her. He glared at Basil.
Why didn't you tell me it was like this at your house?
Basil couldn't withhold the pain within his heart any longer. Tears of shame and embarrassment glazed over his eyes and rolled down over his dirty cheeks. He was now found out. Oh, how could I be so blind? Mrs. O'Mittenthorpe sobbed, shaking her head, scolding herself. Frank! She cried out desperately. Suddenly, Mr. O'Mittenthorpe was heard hurrying up the stairs and, clad in his pajamas, walked into the bedroom.
Lucy?
He frowned disbelievingly, witnessing his wife weeping in a heap on the carpet next to a pile of bloodied clothes. He then eyed Basil and his lacerated back.
Mary, Mother of God!
Mr. O'Mittenthorpe gasped with disgust.
Who in the Lord's name did this wicked evil to you, son?
Call the police, Frank.
No!
Basil protested quickly.
Please don't call.
Mr. and Mrs. O'Mittenthorpe shared worried glances.
He's right,
nodded Mr. O'Mittenthorpe.
He'll be taken into custody, then either be given to a bloody orphanage with the sisters or given back to his father.
Maud, at that moment, had seen enough for one morning and quietly walked past his mother and father, leaving the room. It was all just too disturbing.
Go and check on your sisters, please,
Mr. O'Mittenthorpe said quietly, patting Maud on the shoulder. Mrs. O'Mittenthorpe dragged herself off the carpet and walked toward her husband, glaring into his face. I'm calling Dr. Pelham immediately. She wiped away her tears and left the bedroom. Chapter 5. Later that Saturday evening, the O'Mittenthorpe residence was dark and quiet. Basil was fast asleep in the guest bedroom, getting some much-needed rest. It had been a long day for him, and after 5 sets of stitches, a broken rib, and 2 injections in the backside for the pain, Basil fell asleep happy. For the first time in his life, he slept peacefully, feeling protected in the comforts of Maud's home. But it was not to last. An hour later, Mrs. O'Mittenthorpe was at Basil's bedside, anxiously shaking him awake. Basil! Basil, my love! She hissed quietly through the black of night. Child! Child! Wake up! Wake up! Basil finally stirred, opening his heavy eyes to see Mrs. O'Mittenthorpe's frantic silhouette standing over him, gripping him by his shoulders. The terror on her face was clear. My darling! My darling! She cried desperately. My darling! My darling! Your father is outside! Basil's stomach weakened.
What?
He gasped, his eyes widening. You must leave at once, she explained hastily. Mr. O'Mittenthorpe is out in the front garden trying to calm him down. He's horribly drunk, my love, and eclipsed with rage. Come on, hurry, child, rise now. Basil's heart grew beset with fear, and suddenly his body began locking up. Mrs. O'Mittenthorpe swiftly noted this, and impatiently tugged him by the arm out of the bed. Come on, and carried him downstairs into the kitchen. Without an utterance, she went straight to the wash basket and fished out some fresh clothes. Quickly, quickly, my dear, she nervously whispered, holding on to some trousers for him to slip into. Quickly, quickly, put these on. They hurriedly worked together to get him dressed as painless as possible. They got the fright of their lives when they heard a glass bottle shatter to pieces next to the front door. Too close for comfort, and Basil could now hear his father's loud and very angry voice, screaming obscenities at Mr. O'Mittenthorpe. It sliced terror through his heart like a dagger. It sliced terror through his heart like a dagger.
Calm down, Brenner!
Mr. O'Mittenthorpe's sturdy voice shouted.
You're on my bloody property, so therefore I suggest you keep the damn drunken self well ordered. or I will call the old Bill.
Basil and Mrs. O'Mittenthorpe glared at one another, knowing they were running out of time.
Now, my love, listen to me very, very carefully.
She whispered in a trembling voice, buttoning a shirt onto Basil.
Now, you run across the back garden, over the stone wall and down toward the galley,
she said sternly.
Do you hear me, dear?
Yes, I do.
Basil answered, swiftly nodding his head.
Follow the gully toward the red bridge,
Mrs. O'Mittenthorpe continued.
Walk over the red bridge to the house with the big peach tree in the front garden. All right? And the cobblestone footpath. It's the second house from the bridge. The brother of Mr. O'Mittenthorpe lives here.
Jem?
Yes, Jem.
Mrs. O'Mittenthorpe nodded. Basil absorbed the explicit instructions like a wet sponge.
I understand.
He reassured Mrs. O'Mittenthorpe.
Toward the gully, walk over the red bridge until I see a house with a big peach tree in the front garden, with a cobblestone footpath.
Now, yes, that's right. Now, once there,
Mrs. O'Mittenthorpe murmured quietly, her breath touching Basil's face like a feather.
knock on the back window until Jem opens the door. He has a key to a study that Maud's grandfather owned when he was alive, on the east docks of the Thames.
Does Jem know I'm coming?
Wondered Basil.
No. You can stay at the study for as long as you wish, my darling.
Mrs. O'Mittenthorpe smiled through the dark.
No one has been there since Grandfather Clarence passed.
Suddenly the front door thumped out of its bolts, and the shouting of Basil's father hastily spilled into the kitchen. It sent ripples of terror into the deepest parts of his heart.
Oh, good Lord!
Mrs. O'Mittenthorpe jumped with fright, her fingers to her mouth. She grabbed Basil's boots.
Here, child,
she hissed, impatiently waving her hands at Basil, thrusting each of his feet into them, leaving the laces untied.
Quickly, we're running out of time.
She hurried toward a picture hanging on the wall beside the kitchen sink window and removed it, revealing a hammered-out hole stuffed with an old tin box overflowing with silver. But Mrs. O'Mittenthorpe didn't reach for that. Instead, she grabbed a small gold nugget resting on the silver and put it into Basil's hand. His swollen face glinted in its luster.
Mrs. O'Mittenthorpe, is this...
Yes, it's gold.
She murmured quickly.
Exchange it when you absolutely run out of everything else. We're not sure when we can come to you on the East Docks. At least not until all this mess with your father quietens down.
Basil felt ashamed to take a heavy nugget of gold. He had never even seen real gold.
But Mrs. O'Mittenthorpe...
Shh, hush now, child,
pleaded Mrs. O'Mittenthorpe, pressing a tender hand on his chest.
You'll be needing it far more than any of us, my dear. The moon is almost fully waxed tonight.
She pointed through the kitchen window.
You'll at least see where you're going. Please move hasty, and dare talk not to a soul.
With not a second to spare, she snatched a half loaf of fresh bread from the table and squashed it into Basil's sack, along with any other small food items she could find at hand on the kitchen counter. Finally, she knelt down, meeting Basil face to face, ignoring the brawl escalating outside.
Oh, God, forgive me for sending you out at this hour,
she pleaded within her guilt, her heart cramped like a torn muscle. Yet, alas, she would rather Basil be out in the middle of the night alone than to ever be in the hands of his vicious father ever again. For a fatal mistake it would be, she believed, and one she could not forgive herself of.
Oh, run, child,
she whispered, embracing Basil tenderly. Your secret is safe with us. We'll never disclose your whereabouts to anyone. This, I solemnly promise you. With a small parting kiss on the cheek, Basil rushed through the kitchen door, hobbling down through the back garden. His untied boots crunched over the gravel stone quickly, weaving in and out of the agapanthus, scattered in amongst dewy lemongrass and soursops that glistened within the opaque moonlight. Mrs. O'Mittenthorpe. Mrs. O'Mittenthorpe anxiously stood at the step of the kitchen doorway, with her arms neatly folded across her chest. She said a silent prayer, watching Basil's shadow bounce around the darkened gardens, until he disappeared over the stone wall, and his father's angry voice becoming all but an echo. Basil took to Mrs. O'Mittenthorpe's instructions flawlessly. Over the old stone wall he jumped, and along the gully he tottered. His heavy sack bounced beside him as he limped along as fast as his little weary legs would take him. He was tired and sore, yes, but the relief of narrowly escaping his father erased any pain he felt. Tawny owls hooted in the silver birch trees above him.
Good evening to you.
He giggled, continuing to walk through the silent night within the eerie woods. At last, Basil noticed the red bridge coming into view. Feeling his heart jump with excitement, he dashed through the long gully grass, hobbling up the side of the dewy bank, and finally reached the sturdy bridge. With all his might, he swung his sack up onto it and listened to it thud hard against the wood planks. He then clumsily climbed over the timber rails, and what usually was an exceedingly simple task to do proved to be a real feat in his current woeful state. Squinting through the black of night, he began searching for the house with the big peach tree. He wandered around the edge of the sleepy cul-de-sac until he spotted a wonderfully large tree loaded with a bounty of delicious peaches. And sure enough, right next to it was a cracked cobblestone footpath, twisting through the front garden and wrapping around to the back of the house. Basil smiled with relief, noticing the dim light of a lamp streaming through the front window. Creeping his way around to the back side of the house, he felt terrible to be disturbing Maud's Uncle Jem at such an unruly time of night. Lost in thought of just how he would gather the courage to knock, suddenly the back door swung open with great force, giving Basil a spectacular fright. A tall man wearing suspenders over a tweed, long-sleeved shirt and dark trousers warmly smiled at the doorway.
You must be young, Basil.
The man gently spoke, brushing a hand over his well-kept brown beard.
Good evening to you, sir.
Basil greeted quickly.
I'm Germanus, Maud's uncle. I've seen you at their home at Easter a couple of years ago. Do you remember? Probably not.
Germanus laughed.
You were a sprouty young lad. You can call me Jem.
He thrust his hand out in front of him.
I've heard much about you over the years from young Maud. How do you do?
Basil smiled bashfully, shaking his hand.
Please, do come in. You must be awfully tired, young lad.
Jem relieved Basil of his dragging sack and plopped it beside the back door.
I do apologize for bothering you at this hour, Jem,
said Basil quietly, watching Jem take an oil lamp from the kitchen mantel, quickly striking it with a match, illuminating the living room in a soft glow.
Oh, no, not a bother, young lad.
Jem dismissed, gesturing Basil to a sofa.
But you be a brave lad to be walking these streets at night, though, I tell ya. But anyone would, given the same circumstance as you. And you look to be a feisty lad. I think you could handle yourself, should you ever need to.
Basil nodded politely and sat down. He was absolutely shattered, and all he really wanted to do was to lay down and go back to sleep.
Oh, my, what a pickle you're in. And from the words of my sister-in-law, you've had a bollocks of a day. Yes.
Basil grinned wearily.
Would you care for some milk and biscuits?
Jem kindly offered.
Yes, I'm a little peckish,
Basil answered. And that was putting it politely. He could have eaten the carpet, he was so hungry.
Of course you are.
Jem chuckled lightly.
You must be, lad. You've travelled halfway across Chelsea in the black of night. You didn't bump into any old spooks, did you? Only some owls.
Basil shook his head. Jem was a warm and jolly fellow, and Basil liked him straight away.
I must admit, young lad, you look a ghastly sight.
Jem frowned.
We'll chat a moment, and then get a tottle on.
Jem poured a glass of creamy white milk and opened a large tin of delicious butter biscuits, laying them in front of Basil's watering eyes.
I have the key to my father's study down the east docks.
He said, sitting down beside him.
Do you know where they are? Not really,
said Basil, shoving a Scotch finger into his mouth.
He used to go down there, actually a lot. Planning expeditions, researching, relaxing, with his glass of port.
Jem smiled bittersweetly as he reminisced.
He was an archaeologist, an explorer, and spent many a time in Egypt. Egypt?
Exclaimed Basil, impressed.
What a treat to see the pyramids. Sounds like he had an adventurous spirit. Oh yes, very much so.
Jem sighed, fixated on a picture of his father on the wall.
The study was his refuge, home away from home.
He turned to Basil.
It is a grand place, the study. Thousands of books lining the French plastered walls. Statues and collectibles, original Renaissance art. It has an old winding staircase with a loft. You can sleep up there. I'd imagine, however, it's probably very dirty and dusty. None of us have ever had the heart to return since his passing. Thank you,
Basil replied, swallowing a mouthful of biscuit.
Thank you ever so much for your kindness. Young lad, the hour is late. We must get a shovel on.
Jem rose to his feet.
We need to get there so you can rest. You can drink your milk in the car. Okay.
Jem dimmed the oil lamp and took a big iron key beside the back door. He watched Basil wobbling toward him.
After you,
he said, holding the door open, grabbing Basil's looted sack. The cool, gentle breeze of the night whisked through Basil's black hair as the moon shone on his face. All was quiet, except for the crickets nearby in the garden.
Come along then, young Basil,
Jem murmured quietly, bolting shut the back door. They silently wandered through the garden toward a tin shed that had an old car parked inside.
Here's my girl.
Jem grinned happily, flinging off a dusty green blanket to reveal a 1905 De Diedrich.
Get him, my lad. Do you need a hand? No, thank you,
Basil said, slowly sliding up onto the front seat.
Oh, well, steady on there, boy,
Jem murmured, playing with the choke. He turned the key and with a great big bang, the car sputtered and spattered, as if it hadn't been driven in 100 years.
Hope we don't wake your neighbours,
Basil snickered, holding his ribs.
Oh, she's a funny old car,
Jem beamed, running his fingers along the steering wheel.
We'll be sure to wake up half of London town with this old beauty. We'll have to move swiftly.
They quickly reversed out onto the dark and deserted street, garnering the attention of a few stray tabbies. Jem clunked the gears into first, and off they drove into the still, moonlit night, headed for the East Docks.